Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to support the channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. This is part one of a series entitled Questionable Witnesses, An Atheist Teaches the Life of Christ. Today we'll be looking at Luke 1:1-4, which is Luke's introduction to his gospel. In this series we are looking at the gospels as if I was once again, like I did many times as a church pastor, teach the life of Christ. But this time I'm doing it as an atheist. Because this is the first time we are looking at the Gospel of Luke, let's go over some basics about the book before we get to our first text. I only want to go over sources, date of writing, and authorship at this point, just to kind of give us a little background. The sources for Luke are varied. We are very sure that Luke used Mark as he copies him word for the most part in a large chunk of his gospel. There is also a Q source, a source that appears in Matthew as well. They both quote it word for word, but we have no idea who wrote Q source. Finally, we have C, Luke source, or L, which is material that is completely unique to Luke and appears nowhere else. These three sources combine to give us the book of Luke. I will cover the synoptic problem in a later video, all of its own in this series, once I have touched all three of the synoptic gospels. But for now, just know that 40% of Luke is a direct copy of Mark, 23% of it is copying Q source, and roughly 35% of it is unique to Luke himself. And this actually creates a problem, because the fact that 35% of the book is completely unique to Luke, that means there's only one witness to that 35%. The date of the writing for the most part is considered to be roughly 80 to 110 AD. This is because it has to be written after the writing of the Gospel of Mark, as the writer copies Mark extensively. The traditional view is this was earlier written by Luke, who is a close associate of Paul, is challenged because of the contradictory account between Acts' account of Paul's conversion and Paul's own accounts of his conversion. The theology is different from Paul as well. The text also shows signs of being revised very early, which also gives us some clues. Most scholars put the writing between 80 AD and 110 AD. What we do know about the author is that they do not name themselves. What we know is that the writer also wrote Acts, as the introductions of the both books are very similar, and the writing style and the composition are very similar as well. While Irenaeus names Luke, the beloved physician, as the author, he is writing 60 to 100 years after the writing, depending on whether you take the scholarly or traditional view of when it was written. He is also the only one who says so, which means there's only one witness in historical antiquity who writes many decades later who says that Luke wrote this. We don't have any other real good source for that. We have a few early texts of this gospel preserved, but you don't get a complete preserved copy until about the 4th century. All that said, let's look at the introduction itself. Let's see if we can glean some information about the writer, even though he never names himself. Verse 1, since many have undertaken to compile account of the things accomplished among us. Well, this is really vague in some sentences, as he's not being very specific at this point. If you were reading for the first time, you would be asking, what things? What can be known about the author is that he acknowledges that there are many other accounts of it. In other words, the author uses Mark and Q as a couple of his sources, so he's kind of openly acknowledging that there are many other gospels out there at the time the writer of Luke writes, beyond these two. He also uses the word compile, which indicates he's engaged in assembling information from other sources and putting them together. When we get to verse 2, it says, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. The author indicates in verse 2 that he is not an eyewitness of the events in question himself, as he makes a distinction between himself and the eyewitnesses. But he does indicate something else, that these accounts have been handed down and so they are secondhand. This pretty much is an admission by the author in today's terms that we have these stories because they were given to us by others. This is an admission that this is hearsay content right out the gate. And what makes it worse is there's no verification method like a historian, even at this ancient time, would use. Verse 3 says, it seemed fitting to me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in an orderly sequence, most excellent Theophilus. This kind of indicates that the writer is all he is really doing is taking stories and putting them into some sort of orderly sequence. In truth, all this tells us is about the author's aims is he's trying to put the stories in the order that they happened. That's it. There's no statement of he's trying to verify the stories or find out who witnessed the events. In fact, he kind of just assumes that whoever is handing them his documents is giving him the truth. He doesn't even question it. He is obviously a believer at this point, and he is just taking what people said are the believers' accounts, the eyewitness accounts, and just using them to put together his own gospel. All he is trying to do is put things into an orderly narrative using things that have been handed down to him. And then verse 4 says, so that you may know the exact truth about the things that you have been taught. Now, the writer thinks that this provides him some sort of truth of what they've been taught. But does this methodology pass muster today? No, this method doesn't prove the truth of what they had been taught, despite what the author thinks. It's just proving these stories and teachings were being taught and circulated in early Christianity. It's not a good historical method, and the author not including his own name and the names of where the stories each came from is a glaring weakness in historical methodology. You are still left with the real possibility that all Luke is doing is copying other stories that are nothing more than stories told about Jesus without any kind of verification at all. That's it. He's just copying, and that makes Luke a questionable witness of himself. If an author simply copies a story that is all they have done, doesn't suddenly make that story true just because you copy it. If so, there would be a lot of tall tales and fantasy stories that have just become simply true because people have copied them. Let me give you an example from American folklore. There is a tall tale legendary figure called Johnny Appleseed who supposedly planted apple orchards all across the eastern part of the United States, and if you get farther west, you'll even hear stories about Johnny Appleseed in the Middle West, maybe even as far as California. He's kind of a tall tale that keeps growing depending on where you live. If I were to take all those stories, put them into some sort of chronicle order that kind of orders Johnny Appleseed's life, and then, just copy those stories as I heard them from other people telling the folklore, or I go to other texts that have written down stories about Appleseed and put them into order, would that suddenly make all those stories true? No, it wouldn't. There's a good reason why my original series was called The Tall Tale of Jesus, because I think the method is very simple here and very similar to what Luke is doing. He's taking all the stories about Jesus and he's just trying to put them together and to put some order to the narrative. He's not actually trying to do any historical verification. Luke is not a historian, just a copier of tales. And that's something that I have said many times to many scholars who want to sit there and say that Luke is being the historian of the group. You'll hear this from apologists all the time. Oh, Luke is the historian of the group. He's not an eyewitness, but he's collecting all these eyewitness stories. That doesn't make those eyewitness stories true. Okay, he's just copying the tales. And he really isn't being a historian. A good historian would name themselves, number one, as the person doing the work, because it allows some historical authenticity to be verified. He would also include all of his sources, names of people who gave him the stories, because that also helps with historical verification. The fact is, Luke isn't using a historical method that would even be considered very valid today. He's just collecting stories and putting them into an orderly narrative, which has its own helpfulness in its own right, I suppose, because it helps us to kind of see how things developed, how the stories were told, and how they changed, actually, because they do change, and how they developed over time. That actually is kind of helpful, but the author not including his own name actually kind of really creates a bigger historical authentication problem. And Luke has this in spades. But this is true of all the gospel writers. This is the big problem of none of the gospel writers including their own name, and Luke is just a very good example of all of them. The fact that they don't include their own name is a big, big problem, and Christian apologists don't ever really deal with this other than to say, just because we don't have them named inside their gospel, that doesn't mean we don't have any idea of who they are. And then they try to do this chain of custody argument, But I point out to them that Justin Martyr, Polycarp, and many others never make a statement that there being a chain of custody, nor do they make statements that they actually knew each other. That's church tradition, and church tradition has a notorious habit of being proven false. So what do we have left with what we have here? Well, we have Luke basically telling us what his method is, but we don't even really know that it's Luke. And we don't even know that this method actually gives us any kind of history of the life of Jesus. In fact, I would say it doesn't. Many of the stories in Luke are one-offs. In other words, he's the only witness, the only person who writes these down. They don't even appear in other Gospels that are earlier, which means he could be completely making up a lot of these stories. And that's the real problem. All he's really doing is collecting stories. He's just passing on the mythology. He's just passing on the legend. And he's not really verifying whether anything in the legend is true. That doesn't make him a historian. It just makes him a collector of stories. You might say that the writer of Luke is collecting a lot of oral traditions, some of which have been written down and others have not. But that's all you can say about him. And that makes him a questionable witness as well, on two grounds. Number one, because he is copying certain things word for word. That doesn't make him another witness of those events. That just makes him a copier of the original witness. If a cop just copies down the story of an eyewitness, that doesn't suddenly make the cop another eyewitness. And that's all Luke is doing. So he's not a witness of the events. And because he doesn't record who gave him the stories, where the stories exactly came from, because he's just copying them down, that's not good historical work. Even by the ancient standards of the time, that wouldn't be good history. And so what is he doing? Well, he's copying down legends, and he's trying to put them into order. And that's all he's doing. As much as apologists want to say, oh yeah, this just proves he's the historian of the group and he's copying down witnesses, yeah, that's his own testimony about what he's doing. There's no other witness that authenticates that that's actually what he's doing, which is kind of the other problem. You know, there's no witness that this is actually what the writer is doing. Yeah, you know, I was there when this writer, you know, did this thing, and that's exactly what they did. They just gathered the stories and copied them down. We don't even have that. Okay, he doesn't even have a witness that he did the work exactly as he said he did. We have to take his word for it, purely. End of story, full stop. In fact, that's a problem with a lot of the Gospels. You're just taking their word for it. You don't know them because they don't name themselves, and it becomes a greater problem. This is the problem with the Gospels. This is why they're hearsay, okay, because we don't know who they are. And because we don't know who they are, we come right out the gate of this is hearsay. And sorry, that's just the way it is. And I know a lot of you are going to not like that, but that's what you got. And so there we end. I'd be interested in anybody's thoughts and ideas about this book known as Luke. We're going to get into this a little bit deeper. The next section is John's introduction, which is more theological introduction, but that also has its own problems. So we'll talk more about that when we get there. But thanks for stopping by. I appreciate you. Every like, share, and subscribe. You know, there's many ways to support our mission, which is to try to normalize atheism and deconversion. You can do that through PayPal link. You can do super chat, super thanks. Those are always all appreciated. But the best way you can support any content creator, including me, is to become a member of the channel. Membership, just hit that join button and you'll have your options presented. It just allows me to focus more and more. The more members I get, I focus more and more on doing the content you love and enjoy, and just a little bit less in appeasing the YouTube algorithm. All hail algorithm. But that's where we're going to end today. Just appreciate your thoughts and comments on this one. This whole thing is designed in part to be a discussion starter about the Gospel of Luke as a whole. And so give me your thoughts. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over. So make sure that you're giving all your time, money, and opportunities to yourself, the people you love and care for, to make this a better world. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith. You'll be happier if you do. Trust me, I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.